What makes a human being pick up a weapon and turn it against another human being? What dark impulse buried deep in our psychology drives us to harm each other, to kill each other, to wage wars that consume entire generations? It feels like everywhere we look today, violence surrounds us. The evening news bombards us with stories of conflict, bloodshed, and brutality 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the statistics seem to back up this feeling that the world has never been more dangerous. A study conducted just recently revealed that when news outlets cover crime, 96% of their stories focus exclusively on violent crime. So, if you actually fall asleep to these, subscribe for more. And hey, where are you and what time? Someone from Athens commented, while someone from Atlanta was online too. Completely different sides of the world, same video. Kind of cool when you think about it. Every single hour of every single day in 2021, 52 people lost their lives to violence, and that was just counting homicides, just the murders, nothing else. And if we zoom out to look at the global picture, things seem even bleaker. As of 2024, there are 110 armed conflicts happening right now across the planet. Some of these wars have been raging for more than 50 years, entire lifetimes lived under the shadow of violence. And so when we look at all this carnage, all this suffering, it would be easy to conclude that we are living through the most violent chapter in human history, that something has gone terribly wrong with our species. But here is where things get interesting, because when we dig into the archaeological record, when we examine the bones of our ancient ancestors, when we trace the evolutionary path that led us to become who we are today, a very different picture emerges. Violence, it turns out, is not some modern affliction, not some byproduct of cities and nations and complex societies. It is something far older, far more fundamental to what it means to be human. It is woven into the very fabric of our evolutionary history, stretching back not just centuries or millennia, but hundreds of thousands of years. And to truly understand why we are so violent, why we kill each other, why we wage war, we need to journey back into the deep past to a time when survival itself hung by a thread, to an era when the greatest threat to any human was not a wild animal or a natural disaster, but another human being. When we try to imagine the most violent periods in our species' history, certain eras immediately spring to mind. We think of the 20th century with its two globe-spanning world wars conflicts that dragged every major power on Earth into the bloodshed from 1914 to 1918. The First World War claimed somewhere between 15 and 20 million lives, and then just 2 decades later, an even more devastating conflict erupted. World War II would go on to kill between 70 and 85 million people, nearly 4% of everyone alive at the time. Our minds might also drift back to the medieval period, to the Crusades, where Christian and Muslim armies clashed across the Middle East for 2 centuries, to the Mongol invasions, where the armies of Genghis Khan swept across Asia and into Europe, leaving devastation in their wake. Some historians estimate that the Mongol conquests killed approximately 11% of the entire world population at that time. To put that in perspective, that would be like losing more than 800 million people today. Even further back, the collapse of the Roman Empire plunged Europe into what later historians would call the Dark Ages, centuries of chaos, where marauding tribes, political upheaval, and the breakdown of urban civilization led to widespread violence born from desperation and insecurity. But here is the remarkable thing. Despite all this carnage, despite these periods of unimaginable brutality, we may actually be living through one of the most peaceful times in human history, at least by the standards of our deep evolutionary past. Archaeological evidence paints a stark picture of what life was like for prehistoric humans. The skeletal remains we have recovered from sites all over the world tell a story of near-constant warfare of violence that was not occasional or sporadic, but ever-present and indiscriminate. Women, children, the elderly, no one was spared the brutality. When archaeologists examine bones from prehistoric sites, they frequently find signs of violent death, cracked skulls from blunt force trauma, puncture wounds from spears and arrows, defensive injuries on forearms where people tried to protect themselves from attackers. These marks of violence appear again and again in the archaeological record. And while the absolute numbers may seem small compared to modern wars, the death toll of a world war fought with machine guns and bombers and poison gas was obviously higher. The proportional impact was staggering. Today, less than 1% of all deaths worldwide are caused by violence. When we look at our oldest ancestors, we find that over 3% of deaths on average were violent, and during some particularly brutal periods, that number jumps to 20%, 1 in every 5 people. Meeting a violent end. And so we are left with a profound question. What was it about our ancestors that made them so violent? Is it true that we have somehow evolved into a more peaceful species? Or is that violence still lurking inside us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? To answer this, we need to understand that violence itself is not unique to humans. It permeates the natural world in ways both obvious and subtle, and by examining how other animals kill both prey and each other, we can begin to see where we fit into this brutal picture. Imagine the vast golden grasslands of the Serengeti, the tall grass swaying in the warm breeze, and somewhere hidden in that grass a predator waits a cheetah, its spotted coat blending almost perfectly with the dappled shadows, its muscles coiled, its eyes locked on a target. In the distance, a hare moves cautiously through the grass, nibbling at shoots, completely unaware of the danger, and then in one explosive instant, the cheetah launches itself forward, covering the ground between them with breathtaking speed. The hare realizes the danger. Too late, it bolts, zigzagging desperately, trying to throw off its pursuer, but the cheetah is faster, more agile. It matches every frantic twist, every desperate turn. The chase is a masterpiece of evolution in action, 2 animals locked in a dance that has been perfected over millions of years, the predator driven by hunger, the prey driven by the will to survive, every muscle, every instinct, every adaptation honed for this moment, and then it is over. The cheetah closes the final distance, claws extended, jaws wide, and in one swift motion brings down its prey. This is the predator-prey relationship stripped to its essence, one creature killing another to survive, and it is absolutely fundamental to how ecosystems function. Predators and prey exist in a constant evolutionary arms race where each adaptation in one species drives counter-adaptations in the other. Predators have evolved an arsenal of tools for hunting, sharp claws that can tear through flesh and grip struggling prey, keen eyesight that can spot movement from incredible distances, stealth and camouflage that allow them to get close to their targets, and in some cases, like wolves or lions, the ability to coordinate hunts using teamwork and strategy. Prey animals, meanwhile, have developed their own defences. Some rely on speed, like the gazelle that can outrun most predators over short distances. Others use camouflage, blending so perfectly into their surroundings that they become nearly invisible. Some have physical deterrents, like the porcupine with its coat of sharp quills, or the poison dart frog with its toxic skin. And this back and forth, this endless arms race, creates a fascinating dynamic in predator and prey populations. When prey populations explode, predators have plenty to eat and their numbers rise. But if predators become too successful and decimate the prey population they face, starvation and their own numbers crash. This cyclical pattern helps maintain the delicate balance of ecosystems. The drive to kill, then, is not just a part of survival, it is essential for the health of entire ecosystems. Without predators, prey populations would explode, consuming all available vegetation, and ultimately crashing from starvation. Without prey, predators would vanish, leaving the ecosystem out of balance. But here is where things get more complicated and more relevant to understanding human violence, because killing is not limited to the predator-prey relationship. Animals also kill members of their own species, and they do it for reasons that have nothing to do with food. This is called intraspecies killing, and it happens across the animal kingdom, from insects to mammals. The reasons are varied, but they almost always come back to the same fundamental drives: the need to survive and the drive to reproduce. Territory is one of the most common triggers for violent conflict between members of the same species. Defending a territory is not just about pride or dominance. It is about securing access to the resources needed for survival: food, water, shelter, and crucially, the ability to attract and keep mates. For many animals, losing their territory means losing everything. Male tigers are particularly notorious for their fierce territoriality. They will defend their domain against any rival, even their own brothers. Any encroachment is met with overwhelming violence, and these fights can be deadly. In Lucknow, India, a tiger was observed not only killing a rival male, but dragging the body into the forest and consuming parts of it, a shocking display of dominance and territorial aggression. Competition for reproductive success can be equally brutal. Male northern elephant seals engage in ferocious battles to control harems of females. These clashes are not brief skirmishes. They can last for hours, with the massive bulls using their weight and sharp teeth to tear chunks of flesh from their opponents, all for the chance to pass on their genes. And even after offspring are born, the violence does not stop. Both males and females will kill to protect their young grizzly bear. Mothers are legendary for their aggression when defending cubs. They will attack anything they perceive as a threat, including humans and even other bears. 70% of grizzly bear attacks on humans in North America involve mothers protecting their young. But perhaps the most disturbing form of intraspecies violence to our eyes is infanticide, the killing of young. This behaviour is surprisingly common, occurring in approximately 25% of all mammal species, and the logic behind it, while brutal, makes evolutionary sense. By killing the offspring of a rival male, an animal can ensure that only its own genes are passed on. When male lions take over a new pride, their first act is usually to kill all existing cubs. This eliminates the previous male's genetic legacy and brings the females back into breeding condition sooner, ensuring that the new male's cubs will be the ones to carry on the pride's lineage. Even dolphins, those animals we often think of as friendly and playful, have a dark side. They have been observed killing the calves of rival males to increase their own reproductive success. And so when we survey the natural world, we see that violence is not some aberration. It is brutal, indiscriminate, and widespread, not just between predators and prey, but within species, between rivals, between parents and offspring, between neighbours fighting over resources. You might think that violence would be more common in solitary, antisocial animals, creatures that live alone and have no bonds with others, but when zoologists have studied patterns of lethal violence in nature, they have found something surprising. Violence actually appears to be more common in social, territorial animals than in isolated, non-territorial ones. perhaps there is truth to the old saying that familiarity breeds contempt. When animals live in close quarters, when they have to navigate complex social hierarchies, when they compete with individuals, they see everyday rivalries intensify, desires become more urgent, and violence becomes more likely. And this brings us to primates, our closest relatives in the animal kingdom. Primates are both highly social and territorial, exactly the type of animal we would expect to show high levels of violent behaviour, and the data bears this out. Researchers have analysed data from over 1,000 mammal species, including 102 primate species. They found that intraspecies killing is relatively rare in mammals, overall occurring in only about 0.3% of deaths, but among primates, that rate jumps dramatically to approximately 2%. And when these researchers looked at the fossil evidence from our pre-human ancestors from species like Australopithecus and early members of the genus Homo, they found that those species displayed levels of lethal violence right in line with this primate average, around 2% of deaths caused by violence within the species. But that does not make primates the most violent mammals out there, not by a long shot. Hyenas, for instance, have it much worse. About 8% of hyena deaths are caused by other hyenas, and then there are meerkats. Those cute small mammals that seem so adorable. Around 20% of meerkat deaths are attributable to violence from other meerkats. And so, while primates, including humans, are not the champions of violence in the animal kingdom, we are definitely above average, and this raises a crucial question. Are we inherently more violent than other creatures? And if so, when did this violent streak begin? To answer that, we need to travel back in time far beyond recorded history, beyond the earliest civilizations, beyond even the emergence of our own species. We need to go back to a frozen moment over 5,000 years ago, high in the mountains, where a man was about to die. His name, at least the name we have given him, is Otzi, and he was walking through the Tyrolean Alps, that cold mountain range straddling what is now the border between Italy and Austria. He carried with him the tools of his trade, a copper axe, a bow and arrows, knives made of flint. His body already bore the scars of a hard life, the marks of old injuries. But on this particular day, as Otzi trudged through the high mountain passes, something happened. An arrow flew through the air and struck him in the shoulder, piercing his flesh, tearing through muscle, severing a major artery, as the blood poured out of him, as the snow beneath his feet began to turn red. Perhaps he looked up one last time at the vast blue sky above the peaks before he collapsed and died. 5,000 years later, his body frozen and preserved in the ice would tell us a story of violence and murder. The arrow that killed Otzi came from behind the ambush of a coward, or perhaps a hunter, who saw an opportunity. The unhealed cuts and bruises on his hands, wrists and chest suggest that he had been in a fight 1 or 2 days before his death, and there were signs of head trauma, possibly a final blow delivered as he lay dying. Even more intriguing, the blood of 4 other individuals was found on Otzi's body and equipment, and so a picture emerges. Perhaps Otzi got into a violent confrontation days before his death, maybe over territory or resources or some personal grudge, and then as he made his way up into the mountains to hunt or trade or escape, his opponent followed him, waited for the right moment and struck him down with an arrow. Maybe the attacker had friends and they finished the job together, or maybe Otzi's own. Companions found him dying, tried to help him, and their blood mingled with his as they fought off the attackers. We will never know the exact circumstances, but what we do know is this: 5,000 years ago, high in the Alps, one human being murdered another, and that frozen body preserved by chance gives us a window into the violence that has always been part of our story. But Otzi is just the beginning. If we want to truly understand human violence, we need to go back much further back before modern humans existed, back to our evolutionary cousins and the clues they left behind in their bones. And that journey takes us to a cave in what is now Spain, to a place called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. Deep in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, there lies one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever discovered, a vertical shaft that drops down into darkness, and at the bottom of that shaft, archaeologists found something that has forever changed our understanding of violence in human evolution. The remains of at least 28 individuals, all belonging to a group of early Neanderthals who lived just under 500,000 years ago. Neanderthals are our closest extinct relatives. They shared the Earth with modern humans for tens of thousands of years across Europe and Asia before they disappeared around 40,000 years ago. And during that time of coexistence, there was not just competition between our species, but also interbreeding. Small but significant amounts of Neanderthal DNA persist in modern human populations today, especially in people of European and Asian descent. This genetic legacy has contributed to various traits in modern humans, things like certain aspects of our immune response, our skin pigmentation, possibly even our susceptibility to some diseases. But it also means that the behaviours we can find evidence for in Neanderthals, the capacity for violence, the willingness to kill members of their own species, might have become part of our own inheritance through that interbreeding and cultural exchange. And the individuals buried at Cima de los Huesos have a story to tell about that capacity for violence. Most of the remains belong to young adults, ranging from their late teens to their early 30s, with just a few older adults and younger children mixed in this age. Distribution alone tells us something important about how brutal life was during this period. Few people made it to adulthood, and even fewer survived into old age. But one skull in particular has captured the attention of researchers and sparked intense debate. It is known as Cranium 17, and it belonged to a male probably in his 20s, and this skull bears unmistakable evidence of an attack. 2 significant fractures on the forehead just above the left eye socket. These injuries are not just severe, they are eerily similar in shape and size. Both fractures are deep, clearly the result of blunt force trauma inflicted by some kind of rounded object, perhaps a stone tool or a wooden club. But what makes these wounds particularly telling is their placement and their symmetry. The injuries are positioned in a way that suggests the blows were deliberate, aimed with intent, not accidental, not the result of a fall or some natural disaster. These were targeted strikes meant to incapacitate or kill the individual, was likely hit twice in quick succession of the similarity of the wounds, indicating that the same object was used for both blows. Given the severity of these injuries and their location right on the forehead where the skull is vulnerable, it is almost certain that these blows were fatal, and so what we may be looking at here is evidence of the earliest murder in the archaeological record, a Neanderthal killed by another Neanderthal in a deliberate act of violence 500,000 years ago. But Cranium 17 is not alone in bearing the marks of violence. Far from it. The story of Neanderthal brutality extends across Europe and the Middle East, scattered across dozens of archaeological sites. In a cave in Iraq, archaeologists discovered the damaged remains of a male Neanderthal who lived around 50,000 years ago. This individual had suffered a rib injury caused by a sharp projectile weapon, likely a thrown spear, the kind of wound that could easily have been fatal. Perhaps this Neanderthal was killed in a territorial dispute or died during a conflict with neighbouring groups of humans. Maybe he was dragged into the cave by his companions seeking shelter, or maybe he crawled there, himself trying to find a dark, cool place to die alone. And this Iraqi male is not the only example of violent Neanderthal death. An even more disturbing case occurred nearly 100,000 years earlier at a site known as Krapina Cave in what is now Croatia. Multiple Neanderthal remains have been uncovered at Krapina, and many of these bones display cut marks and fractures that are consistent with perimortem trauma injuries inflicted at the point of death or immediately after. And so we are left with a troubling question: what could have motivated these aggressors to not only kill but to mutilate the bodies? One theory that has gained traction is that these markings might be evidence of cannibalism. The numerous broken bones and cracked open marrow channels could indicate that Neanderthals used stone tools to extract bone marrow from the dead. This would be consistent with other archaeological evidence suggesting that Neanderthals sometimes resorted to eating their own kind when food was scarce, when hunting was poor, when survival became desperate. But the markings on the skulls found at Krapina tell a different and perhaps less horrifying story, one that speaks to ritual rather than hunger. Some archaeologists argue that the scratches on these skulls are not consistent with the kind of damage you would expect if the goal was to extract and consume the brain. Instead, they suggest that the damage might be evidence of a last rite, a ritual performed out of love and respect for the dead. This interpretation is supported by other findings at Krapina. 11 of the Neanderthals found there had healed injuries that would not have been survivable without care from others. Some of the bones show evidence of trauma that would have caused severe pain that would have required cleaning and treatment, and 2 of the skeletons had damage to their spines that would likely have left them with limited mobility, meaning they would have needed ongoing support from their group to survive. And so we see 2 sides of Neanderthal nature: the capacity for brutal violence against outsiders, against enemies, and at the same time the capacity for compassion and care for members of their own group. But not all the evidence is so ambiguous. In France, archaeologists discovered the Laferessier 1 Neanderthal skull, which shows a deep fracture caused by a powerful blow to the head, and in the El Cidron caves in Spain, the remains of 12 Neanderthals dated to around 49,000 years ago display numerous cut marks and fractures, all consistent with an assault. These examples taken together paint a complex picture of Neanderthal life. They were capable of violence, yes, but that violence existed alongside other behaviours, caregiving ritual, possibly even spirituality. The evidence from sites like Shanidar and Krapina and Laferessier and El Cidron reveals that Neanderthals experienced and engaged in acts of violence for many different reasons: territorial disputes, resource competition, revenge, ritual, and perhaps reasons we cannot even begin to guess at. And so what does all this evidence about our evolutionary cousins tell us about our own species, about Homo sapiens, as we trace the fossil record away from these ancient relatives and toward our own ancestors? Do we see the same patterns of violence? Do we find the same brutal marks on the bones? The answer is yes, but the story becomes even more disturbing. The first anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago. They looked like us, with high foreheads, smaller brow ridges, bodies that would not seem out of place walking down a street today. These early humans were hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic groups, moving across the landscape following game and seasonal plants. They were resourceful and adaptable, using sophisticated tools made from stone, bone and wood. They almost certainly had complex language. The ability to communicate abstract ideas and plan for the future evidence of early art and careful burial practices suggests they were capable of symbolic thought, of contemplating their own mortality. Socially, they lived in tight-knit bands, cooperating in hunts, sharing food and knowledge across generations, building the foundations that would eventually lead to more complex societies. But they also lived in a dangerous world where competition for resources was fierce, where neighbouring groups might be rivals or threats, and where violence was never far away, and we can see that violence written in their bones. In Sudan, at a site called Jebel Sahaba, archaeologists uncovered what is believed to be one of the earliest known mass graves, a cemetery containing the remains of at least 61 Homo sapiens who died between 13 and 14,000 years ago, and of those 61 individuals, roughly 40% show clear evidence of violent death. The bones tell a grim story: puncture wounds from arrows or spears, broken bones from blunt force trauma, defensive injuries on arms where people tried to shield themselves from attackers, men, women, children, even infants. None were spared the violence. Researchers believe this grave is evidence of a long-running conflict, possibly a series of raids and counter-raids between rival groups competing for resources in a region where climate change was making survival increasingly difficult. This was not a single battle, but a sustained period of warfare that claimed dozens of lives over months or perhaps years. And this pattern of violence continues at other sites across Africa and beyond. A few thousand years later at Naturuk in Kenya, attackers massacred what appears to have been an entire community 10,000 years ago. The people living at Naturuk were hunter-gatherers, settled near a lagoon on the shore of Lake Turkana. It would have been a rich environment full of fish and birds and game, but someone else wanted it. The attackers killed at least 27 people, including men, a pregnant woman, and young children. Notably, there are very few adult female skeletons in the grave, suggesting that women of childbearing age may have been abducted. The fact that children were among the dead indicates this was not a skirmish between rival groups of warriors, but a deliberate attempt to wipe out an entire community. Many of the skeletons display head wounds inflicted by clubs or stones, and a large number of the males have devastating injuries to their legs, ribs and hands. Arrowheads were found embedded in bones, and some of the remains were discovered in positions suggesting they had been bound before they were killed. And perhaps most tellingly, the weapons used in this massacre were not local. They came from somewhere else. This indicates that the attackers were not neighbours in a spontaneous conflict, but rather a group that had travelled to Naturuk specifically to take what they wanted, and they were willing to kill everyone who stood in their way. The Naturuk site provides compelling evidence that organised large-scale violence occurred among prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies, challenging the old assumption that warfare only emerged with the development of agriculture and permanent settlements. And Naturuk is not alone in telling this dark story. Near modern-day Vienna, archaeologists discovered a mass grave containing the remains of 200 individuals, their bones shattered, their skulls pierced, an entire community wiped out in what must have been a coordinated attack. At Schöneck-Kilienstetten in Germany, another mass grave held the remains of adults and children, all killed in an act of early warfare. The leg bones of the young men had been systematically shattered after death, a brutally unnecessary addition to an already overwhelming act of violence. And at Halberstadt, yet another mass grave revealed bodies dumped without ceremony, all bearing severe fractures to the skull. Many of these fractures were clearly delivered after the individuals were already dead, suggesting a kind of ritualized violence, or perhaps just rage, that could not be satisfied even by killing. These discoveries fundamentally changed our understanding of prehistoric human societies. They show that even nomadic hunter-gatherers, people without cities or armies or complex political structures, engaged in organized violence. They fought wars over resources and territory. They massacred entire communities, and they did so with a level of brutality that is difficult for us to comprehend. And so the uncomfortable truth that emerges from this archaeological evidence is that the capacity for violence has been with us from the very beginning of our species. It is not something that emerged with civilization or agriculture or the state. It appears to be something fundamental to who we are as humans. From our earliest origins, we have carried the potential to inflict terrible harm on each other. The marks on these ancient bones speak to a reality that we might prefer to ignore, that violence against our own kind has been present since the dawn of Homo sapiens. The persistent presence of violence throughout our evolutionary history suggests that aggression may not be merely a byproduct of how we live, but a core element of our nature, something that has shaped our social dynamics and our history for hundreds of thousands of years. And this raises a profound and unsettling question: if violence is so deeply rooted in our past, so consistent across time and geography and culture, could it be embedded in our very biology? Is violence written into our genes, passed down through the generations, as surely as the colour of our eyes or the shape of our faces? To answer that question, we need to look not just at bones and artifacts, but at living creatures, at our closest relatives on the tree of life, at primates whose behaviour might give us clues about our own violent impulses. In 1974, deep in the Tanzanian jungle, something happened that would forever change how we think about violence in primates and, by extension, in ourselves. A community of chimpanzees that had lived together peacefully for years suddenly split apart. One group broke away from the main community. They called themselves, or rather researchers called them, the Kahama, and they established their territory in a nearby region, leaving behind the original Kasakila community, and what followed over the next 4 years was nothing short of warfare. These two groups of chimpanzees engaged in regular violent confrontations, brutal attacks that would ultimately lead to the complete annihilation of the Kahama group. Every single male was killed, most of the females either disappeared or were absorbed into the Kasakila community, and what made this conflict so shocking to the researchers observing it was not just the violence itself, but the sophistication of that violence. The Kasakela chimpanzees were not fighting out of sudden rage or instinct. They were strategic, coordinated, deliberate. They would patrol the borders of their territory in groups, and when they encountered a Kahama male who was alone, separated from his group, they would launch coordinated ambushes. Multiple Kasakela males would attack a single victim, overwhelming him with numbers, beating him, kicking him, biting him until he could no longer defend himself, and then they would continue the assault long after he was incapacitated, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes until the victim's injuries were fatal. This was not mindless violence. This was calculated, strategic brutality. Violence used as a tool to achieve a goal, the elimination of rivals and the expansion of territory. And it was the first time researchers had observed this level of premeditated, coordinated aggression in non-human primates, and the Gombe chimpanzee war, as it came to be known, was not an isolated incident. Chimpanzees, both in the wild and in captivity, regularly engage in violence that results in serious injury or death. Male chimpanzees in particular form coalitions to assert dominance within their social groups, and they use violence to maintain that dominance. Studies have shown that these coalitions dramatically increase a male's access to mating opportunities and improve his standing in the group hierarchy. The behaviour observed in the Kasakela chimpanzees attacking lone rivals in coordinated ambushes is actually quite common in chimpanzee populations. Researchers call it lethal raiding, and it serves multiple purposes. It eliminates competition for food and mates. It expands territory, giving the victorious group access to more resources, and it establishes dominance, demonstrating to neighbouring groups that this community is powerful and dangerous. But chimpanzees are not the only primates that give us insights into the roots of violence. Gorillas, our more distant relatives, tell a somewhat different story. Gorillas are generally less violent than chimpanzees, and this probably relates to their different social structure and territorial behavior. Gorilla ranges often overlap without conflict. They seem more willing to share space with neighboring groups, but that does not mean gorillas are peaceful. When resources become scarce or when there is instability in a group, for instance when the dominant silverback male dies, violence can erupt quickly. Male gorillas, especially the large silverbacks, are fiercely protective of their group. A threatened silverback will engage in impressive displays of aggression, chest-beating, loud vocalizations, charges meant to intimidate, and if those displays fail to deter a threat, he will not hesitate to attack using his massive strength and sharp canine teeth as weapons. Violence within gorilla groups also occurs particularly among males, though studies suggest that much of this aggression is ritualistic. It serves to establish or reaffirm the social hierarchy within the troop rather than to cause serious harm. It is a way of working out who is in charge without necessarily killing each other. But like chimpanzees, gorillas also practice infanticide. Male gorillas will kill the offspring of rival males to eliminate genetic competition and ensure their own reproductive success. Research indicates that up to 5% of infant gorillas die from infanticide, and approximately 1/4 of all infant deaths can be attributed to males killing them. And so both chimpanzees and gorillas, our closest living relatives, display patterns of violence that should sound familiar: territorial aggression, competition for mates, strategic use of lethal force and infanticide, all behaviors we see reflected in human history. But these examples raise an important question. Why is violence preserved so strongly in the primate lineage? Why do primates, including humans, seem to be more violent than many other mammals? By combining insights from zoology, anthropology, and psychology, researchers have begun to understand the evolutionary logic behind primate violence, and the answer comes down to reproductive success. A certain level of aggression can ensure survival by fighting off rivals. Male chimpanzees and gorillas secure priority access to females, which means they pass on their genes, including genes that may predispose their offspring toward aggression. Stronger, more aggressive males are also better at protecting their mates and offspring from threats, whether those threats come from predators or from rival males, and more aggressive males are more likely to achieve and maintain alpha status within their social groups, which further ensures that they can reproduce and that their offspring will thrive. In short, from an evolutionary perspective, violence pays off for male primates. It increases reproductive success, which means violent tendencies get passed down to the next generation, and the group as a whole may benefit from having strong, aggressive males who can defend territory and resources. But this is not the complete picture, because there is one group of primates that seems to have taken a very different evolutionary path, and their story complicates our understanding of whether violence is truly inevitable in primates. Deep in the rainforests of the Congo Basin in Central Africa lives a species of primate that shares approximately 99% of its DNA with us, just like chimpanzees do, but their society could not be more different. These are bonobos, and they have earned a reputation as the peaceful primates. Bonobos live in matriarchal societies where females hold most of the social power. This female-centered structure appears to help mitigate conflict and promote cooperative behavior in ways that are strikingly different from the male-dominated hierarchies of chimpanzees. And bonobos have developed a unique strategy for managing social tension. They use sexual behavior not just for reproduction, but as a tool for building bonds, reducing stress, and diffusing conflicts that might otherwise turn violent. Observers have noted that bonobos seem remarkably willing to engage in sexual behavior with partners of any age or sex, apparently as a way to keep the peace. This does not mean bonobos are completely non-violent. Males have been observed kicking, hitting and punching other males during disputes, and interestingly, these aggressive interactions happen more frequently than similar conflicts among chimpanzees, but the crucial difference is in the severity. Bonobos fight, but they fight less viciously. The violence is relatively mild and constrained. And most tellingly, no one has ever documented a case of one bonobo killing another in the wild or in captivity. This stands in stark contrast to chimpanzees, where lethal violence is well documented and not uncommon. The existence of bonobos suggests that while violence may be part of our primate heritage, it is not inevitable that primates are capable of developing social structures and behaviors that minimize lethal aggression, that there are mechanisms for peaceful coexistence and conflict resolution built into our evolutionary potential. And this brings us to a critical juncture in our investigation. We have established that violence is ancient, that it appears throughout the archaeological record, that our closest primate relatives both display aggressive behaviours and yet also show capacity for restraint. And now we must ask the most difficult question of all: is human violence genetic? Is there something in our DNA that makes us more prone to killing each other? We know that humans share approximately 98 to 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos. We diverged from our common ancestor with chimps somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago. That may seem like a vast gulf of time, but in evolutionary terms it is actually quite recent, and despite our genetic similarity, that remaining 1 to 2% of DNA that differs between us makes an enormous difference. It accounts for our larger brains, our capacity for complex language, our ability to create art and build civilizations, but could some of that different DNA also influence our capacity for violence? Researchers have focused attention on a family of enzymes called monoamine oxidases. These enzymes play a crucial role in breaking down neurotransmitters in the brain. Neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. These chemicals are intimately involved in mood regulation. Dopamine, for instance, is sometimes called the happy hormone because low levels of dopamine correlate with feelings of unhappiness, irritability, and sometimes anger. Variations in the genes that code for monoamine oxidases have been linked to differences in aggression and violence both in animals and in humans. Some variants of these genes seem to be associated with higher levels of aggressive behavior, while other variants correlate with lower aggression. But here is where we need to be extremely careful, because it would be dangerous and misleading to reduce this complex research down to a simplistic conclusion that certain genes make people violent. Human behavior is not determined by any single gene or even a handful of genes. Any genetic predisposition toward aggression will interact with a vast array of other factors: the way a person is raised in childhood, the nutrition they receive, the environmental stresses they face, exposure to trauma or abuse, the culture they grow up in, the opportunities available to them. All of these things shape how genetic tendencies are expressed. No single gene can be isolated as the cause of violence. Instead, what we see is that multiple genetic factors interact with multiple environmental factors in complex and often unpredictable ways to influence aggressive behavior. But even with all those caveats, even acknowledging that genes are not destiny, the research does suggest something important within our DNA. There is written the capacity for violent behavior. This capacity exists because in our evolutionary past, under certain circumstances, violence conferred advantages. It helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, and those genes got passed down to us. The observations we can make from studying our primate relatives and the horrifying evidence we find in ancient human remains all point to the same conclusion: we carry genes that can influence our tendency toward aggression. But, and this is crucial, we also carry genes that promote cooperation, empathy, caregiving, all the prosocial behaviours that allow us to live together in large, complex societies, and how those genes are expressed, which behaviours become dominant, depends enormously on the environment we create for ourselves. This process of natural selection means that we inherited a complex toolkit of behavioral possibilities: violence, yes, but also compassion, aggression, yes, but also cooperation, the capacity to kill, but also the capacity to care, and that complexity, that dual nature, is perhaps the most fundamentally human thing about us. We are not simply violent apes, nor are we inherently peaceful beings. We are both and neither, and understanding that paradox is essential to understanding ourselves. Ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle grappled with this question of human nature more than 2,000 years ago. He wrote that the virtues arise in us neither by nature nor contrary to nature, but rather we are adapted by nature to receive them and made perfect by habit. In other words, Aristotle believed we are naturally open to moral instruction, that we have the capacity to become either violent or peaceful, and through practice, through habit, we develop one tendency or the other. He described humans as political animals who naturally seek to live in communities, who create societies, not because we are forced to, but because it is part of our nature. In the East, Confucian philosophy aligned with this view, arguing that humans are born inherently good, though easily led astray by negative influences in the 18th century. French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau took this idea further. He believed that humans in their natural state were peaceful, and that it was civilization itself, the development of property and social hierarchies, that corrupted this inherent goodness and led to violence. But not everyone agreed. 17th century British philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued the exact opposite to Hobbes. Humans were inherently violent creatures, and only the constraints imposed by society kept us from constant warfare. In his famous work, Leviathan, Hobbes described life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, without government, without laws, without social contracts. Hobbes believed humans would be in perpetual conflict, driven by fear and the desire for self-preservation. These philosophical traditions offer us two fundamentally different visions of human nature. Are we naturally violent, with societal structures serving as a necessary restraint on our aggressive impulses, or are we naturally peaceful, with violence emerging only when society fails or corrupts us? And here is where the archaeological and anthropological evidence can help us answer that question, because if we step back and look at the broad sweep of human history over the past several thousand years, a pattern emerges that might surprise you. Despite all the mass graves we have discovered scattered across continents, despite the clear evidence of prehistoric massacres and territorial conflicts, historical data reveals something unexpected for most of human history. We have actually been relatively peaceful. This does not mean violence was absent, far from it, but it was not constant, not ubiquitous. The archaeological record shows that periods of intense violence were interspersed with much longer stretches of relative calm, when times were good, when resources were plentiful. Ancient human groups tended to avoid conflict with their neighbours. But things changed dramatically around 14,000 years ago. The archaeological record from this period shows a sudden uptick in sites that bear evidence of violent attacks, of communities destroyed, of mass graves filled with the victims of organised warfare. And this timing is significant because 14,000 years ago corresponds roughly with the beginning of a major transition in how humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years. We had been nomadic hunter-gatherers moving across the landscape following game and seasonal plants. But around this time in various parts of the world, people began to settle down to establish more permanent communities, to develop agriculture. And with settlement, with the creation of permanent homes and farms, something else emerged, a deeper sense of group identity. People began to identify not just with their immediate family or their small nomadic band, but with their village, with their territory, with the specific piece of land they called home. And with that deeper sense of community came something else, a sharper awareness of who was not part of that community. The outsider, the stranger, the person from over the hill became not just different but potentially threatening. This may have led early settled humans to become more protective of their homes, more ready to view outsiders as rivals or enemies, more willing to use violence to defend what they saw as theirs. And we can see the consequences of this shift written in the bones buried during this period, and this pattern continues throughout human history. If we track violence across millennia, we see it rise and fall in waves correlating with periods of social stability and instability. During the Mesolithic period, approximately 10 to 5,000 years ago, some regions show violence rates as high as 15% of all deaths, but these spikes were not constant or universal. They varied dramatically by location and time. In the Middle East, there was a spike of violence around 6,500 years ago, possibly related to resource competition as populations grew, and then another spike 3,000 years ago during a period of widespread drought and political upheaval. More recently, during the era of European colonization, extreme violence was perpetrated as European powers expanded into the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. In the Americas alone, estimates vary widely, but scholars believe the indigenous population before European contact was somewhere around 60 million people. 100 years after contact, that number had fallen to between 6 and 7 million. Most of these deaths resulted from exposure to diseases that the indigenous populations had no immunity to: smallpox, measles, typhus. But this catastrophic die-off was still a direct consequence of colonization, of a forceful and almost universally unwanted occupation. And so yes, these numbers are sobering. The level of violence and death associated with colonization was immense, but even these horrific episodes do not represent a constant state of human aggression and rage. Instead, they reflect specific periods of turmoil and transition moments when established orders collapsed, when resources became scarce, when powerful groups decided to expand at the expense of weaker ones. Civilizations rise and fall, empires expand and contract, and throughout these cycles we see violence surge during times of instability and decline, during times of stability and growth. But here is the remarkable thing, the overall trend. The big picture trajectory of human violence over thousands of years has been toward greater peace, not less. The tendency in humans toward more cooperative and less violent relationships can be traced back as far as 200,000 years ago, when early social pressures began shaping human behavior in new ways, pushing us toward cooperation rather than conflict. And one of the most intriguing theories that attempts to explain this shift toward greater peace is the concept of self-domestication. The theory of self-domestication suggests that humans underwent a process similar to what happens when we domesticate other animals, except in our case, the selection pressure came from within our own species. When humans domesticate other animals, we select for certain traits. We breed dogs for loyalty and trainability. We breed cattle for docility. The animals that are too aggressive, too unpredictable, too difficult to handle get culled from the breeding population, and over many generations, this selective pressure produces animals that are fundamentally different from their wild ancestors. And self-domestication theory proposes that something similar happened to humans. Early human groups would have faced strong pressure to manage aggressive individuals. Someone who was constantly violent, who attacked others in the group unpredictably, who could not control their temper, would have been a liability. In small, tightly knit groups where cooperation was essential for survival, these hyper-aggressive individuals might have been ostracized, expelled from the group, or in extreme cases killed, and that means their genes, their predisposition toward reactive aggression, would not get passed on to the next generation. Over thousands of generations, this selective pressure against reactive aggression would have changed us just as it changed wolves into dogs. Signs of this self-domestication process include a decrease in reactive aggression responding to triggers with immediate violence, a continuation of juvenile traits into adulthood, such as playfulness and curiosity, and on a neurological level, more sophisticated regulation of neurotransmitters related to both bonding and aggression. In the same way that dogs have been bred to remain puppy-like well into adulthood, always eager to play, always seeking approval from humans, perhaps we humans evolved socially to be calmer, more cooperative, more capable of controlling our aggressive impulses. But self-domestication is not the only theory that attempts to explain our gradual shift away from constant violence. Another explanation focuses on the development of something uniquely human: complex language. Some scientists believe that humans developed sophisticated language somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, and this ability to communicate abstract ideas, to coordinate actions, to plan for the future would have fundamentally changed how human groups functioned. Before, complex language conflicts within a group would have been resolved through physical confrontation. The strongest, most aggressive individual would dominate through force, but with language, subordinate members of a group gained a new tool. They could talk to each other about their leaders, they could form alliances, they could coordinate their actions, and they could use collective pressure to keep aggressive leaders in check. This concept is known as reverse dominance hierarchy. In a nutshell, reverse dominance hierarchy means that lower-ranking members of a group can band together to constrain the power of would-be tyrants. Instead of one strong individual dominating through physical force, the group as a whole maintains control through coalition and consensus. Imagine an early human band led by an aggressive alpha male who takes more than his share of food and mates before language. The only way to challenge this male would have been through physical confrontation, a fight that the challenger might lose. But with language, subordinate males could talk among themselves, they could recognize their shared grievance, they could agree on a course of action, and they could present a united front to the alpha male back off and share resources more fairly, or face the consequences from all of us together. This ability to form language-based coalitions would have made direct confrontation less necessary and less desirable. A leader who responded to group pressure calmly and rationally, who was willing to compromise and cooperate, would have been more successful than one who tried to rule through violence and intimidation. And over time, this selective pressure would have favoured individuals who were less reactive, less prone to explosive aggression, more capable of negotiation and compromise, according to anthropologist Christopher Boehm. Whatever the mechanism by which someone becomes a leader, in these egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, it involves coalitional power rather than individual fighting prowess. But we need to be careful not to overstate this theory, because the reality is we do not know exactly when language emerged. We cannot pinpoint with certainty whether it developed 200,000 or 300,000 years ago or even earlier. And that makes it difficult to definitively tie language development to a decrease in violence. However, despite these uncertainties, the overarching conclusion from anthropological research is clear. While humans absolutely have the potential for violence, that potential has been increasingly constrained by our movement into larger, more cohesive, collaborative societies. Elise Waterston, president of the American Anthropological Association, puts it this way: humans have the potential for violence, which is fundamentally different from having a tendency toward violence. And that distinction is crucial. The potential is always there, the capacity for aggression built into our evolutionary history and encoded in our genes. But whether that potential becomes reality depends enormously on the social structures we create, the norms we establish, the ways we organize our societies. As human societies have grown larger and more complex, we have developed increasingly sophisticated systems for managing our relationships and minimizing violence. We created hierarchies of leadership, from village elders to chieftains to kings to emperors to democratically elected officials. We devised systems of law, codes of behavior that defined what was acceptable and what was not, and we created mechanisms for enforcing those laws, from informal social pressure to formal police forces and judicial systems. We built prisons to contain individuals who could not or would not follow the rules. And perhaps most importantly, we developed strong cultural attitudes that reject violence as a solution to conflicts. And the impact of all these social innovations is striking today. Worldwide homicide rates hover around 6 per 100,000 people, much lower than the 2% we observe in our primate relatives and far below the rates seen in our prehistoric ancestors. This dramatic reduction in violence highlights just how much influence social structures and cultural norms have in shaping human behavior. We have not evolved to be biologically less violent. Our genes are essentially the same as they were thousands of years ago, but we have created environments that make violence less necessary, less acceptable, and less common. However, this is not quite the end of the story, because there is one form of organized violence that persists, one that continues to claim lives on a massive scale, and that is war. While the risk of being killed by another individual in a personal conflict has decreased dramatically in modern societies, the spectre of war still looms large over human civilization, and in some ways our capacity for organized violence has become more terrifying, not less. Throughout most of human history, warfare was fought at close range with clubs and spears and swords. The killing required physical proximity. You had to look your enemy in the eye. You had to feel the resistance as your weapon struck flesh. And while these conflicts could be brutal and deadly, the absolute numbers of casualties were limited by the technology and tactics available. But then we developed ranged weapons, bows and arrows that could kill from a distance, crossbows that could pierce armor, and then came the invention that would change warfare forever: gunpowder. The development of firearms and explosives meant that soldiers could kill enemies. They could barely see enemies who were hundreds of yards away, and as weapons technology continued to advance, that distance grew. We developed artillery that could bombard cities from miles away, airplanes that could drop bombs from thousands of feet, nuclear weapons that could obliterate entire cities in an instant. Our capacity for inflicting mass casualties has grown exponentially, and we saw the full horror of this reality in the 20th century. With the two world wars, World War II in particular stands as the deadliest conflict in human history, involving every continent, resulting in the deaths of between 70 and 85 million people, nearly 4% of the entire world's population at that time. And yet something interesting happened after World War II in the 1990s. Following the end of the Cold War, there was a dramatic drop in mortality from warfare. Wars were still happening, conflicts still erupted, but fewer people were dying in them. And this decline occurred even as we possessed the most advanced, deadly weaponry ever created. So what changed? Part of the explanation may be that the nature of warfare shifted. Conflicts were increasingly fought at smaller scales between insurgent groups and governments rather than between major world powers. The massive state-on-state wars that had characterized the first half of the 20th century became rarer. Battlefield tactics also improved. Militaries developed more targeted, precise operations using intelligence and special forces rather than massive frontal assaults. Long-range weapons and advanced technology meant that fewer soldiers needed to be exposed to direct combat. And there was another factor, the intervention of international peacekeeping organizations like the United Nations. While imperfect, these institutions have played a role in mediating conflicts, preventing escalation, and sometimes keeping warring parties separated. Perhaps it says something hopeful about human nature, that even as we have developed increasingly lethal weapons, we have shown some restraint in using them. The fact that nuclear weapons have not been used in warfare since 1945, despite many tense moments during the Cold War, suggests that humans are capable of pulling back from the brink. But before we become too optimistic, we need to acknowledge that large-scale warfare is on the rise again. More countries experienced armed conflict in 2016 than at any point in the previous 30 years. And we are entering a new technological era where artificial intelligence, drones, and other precision weapons could fundamentally change how wars are fought. It is too soon to tell whether these technologies will make warfare more or less deadly, whether they will make it easier to wage war, or whether the precision will allow for more targeted, less destructive conflicts. And so the question of whether we are becoming more or less violent as a species remains open. The long-term trend suggests we are moving toward greater peace, but that trend is not linear. Not guaranteed. Violence surges and retreats like a tide, and we cannot predict with certainty what the future holds. But where does all this leave us today as we navigate a world that feels simultaneously more connected and more divided than ever before? We live in an age where information travels instantaneously, where we can watch events unfold on the other side of the planet in real time, where our phones buzz with breaking news alerts about conflicts, crimes, tragedies happening thousands of miles away. And this constant stream of information, this 24-hour cycle of news reporting, creates a distorted perception of violence in the world. We are bombarded with images and stories of warfare, terrorism, mass shootings, violent crimes, and our brains evolved to pay attention to threats, naturally fixate on these stories. The result is that many people today believe we are living through an unprecedented era of violence, that the world has never been more dangerous, that humanity is spiraling into chaos. But as we have seen from the archaeological and historical evidence, this perception does not match reality. Yes, violence still exists. Yes, wars are still fought. Yes, people are still murdered. But the rates of violence have declined dramatically compared to our ancestral past. We are statistically living in one of the most peaceful periods in human history. And yet our perception tells us the opposite. And this disconnect between reality and perception has real consequences. It shapes how we vote, how we view strangers, how we raise our children, how much fear we carry with us every day. Understanding this gap between perception and reality is crucial because it affects how we think about human nature itself. If we believe humans are becoming more violent, we might conclude that our violent tendencies are overwhelming our better angels, that despite all our progress, we are doomed to repeat the cycles of bloodshed. But if we recognize that violence has actually declined, even as our awareness of violence has increased, we can see a different story, one where human culture and social organization have successfully constrained our violent impulses, where we have collectively decided that violence is not an acceptable way to resolve conflicts. This cultural evolution represents one of the most significant achievements of our species. We have not changed our biology. We still carry the same genes that our prehistoric ancestors carried, the same capacity for aggression, but we have changed our behavior through social learning, through the transmission of values and norms across generations. Every human society develops rules about when violence is acceptable and when it is not. These rules vary across cultures. What is considered justifiable in one society might be seen as murder in another, but the existence of these rules, the fact that every culture attempts to regulate violence, speaks to a universal human need to manage our aggressive impulses. And over time, as societies have become more interconnected, as ideas and values have spread across cultural boundaries, we have seen a general trend towards stricter prohibitions on violence, toward a broader definition of who deserves protection from harm. Slavery, once widely practiced and accepted, is now universally condemned, at least officially. Torture, once a standard tool of justice and warfare, is now internationally prohibited. The rights of children, women, minorities have expanded dramatically over the past few centuries. None of this means violence has disappeared, far from it, but it does mean that the circle of who we consider deserving of moral consideration has grown larger, and as that circle expands, the acceptable targets for violence shrink. This expansion represents a kind of moral progress. Not biological evolution, but cultural evolution. The accumulation of ethical insights and social innovations passed down and built upon by each generation. But this progress is fragile. It can be reversed under the right circumstances, or perhaps the wrong circumstances, when resources become scarce, when fear takes hold, when demagogues stoke hatred and division, when group identities harden and outsiders are dehumanized. The constraints on violence can weaken. And we see this pattern playing out in various parts of the world today, regions that had achieved relative peace descending back into conflict as old grievances resurface, as political leaders exploit ethnic or religious divisions for their own gain. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. The conflict in Yemen has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Ethnic violence in Myanmar against the Rohingya people has resulted in what the United Nations has called ethnic cleansing. These conflicts remind us that the trend toward peace is not inevitable, that violence remains a tool that humans can and will use when they feel threatened, when they see others as enemies, when the social structures that normally constrain aggression break down. And this brings us back to the central question we have been wrestling with throughout this exploration: are we violent by nature or peaceful by nature? And perhaps the answer is that this is the wrong question, because humans are not simply one thing or the other. We are both and neither simultaneously. We evolved in environments where violence sometimes paid off, where aggressive individuals could secure more resources, more mates, higher status, and so natural selection favoured the capacity for violence. But we also evolved in environments where cooperation was essential, where sharing resources, caring for the sick, protecting the young meant the difference between survival and extinction, and so natural selection also favoured empathy, compassion, the ability to work together. What makes humans unique is not that we are violent. Primates are violent. Many mammals are violent. What makes us unique is the scale and sophistication of both our violence and our cooperation. No other species can organize violence on the scale that humans can. We can coordinate attacks involving millions of soldiers across multiple continents using weapons that can kill from thousands of miles away, but no other species can organize cooperation on our scale. Either we can coordinate efforts involving billions of people working together to build global trade networks, to establish international laws to tackle challenges like climate change and disease. And this same duality, this capacity for both extraordinary violence and extraordinary cooperation, exists within each individual human. We are all capable of acts of great cruelty and acts of profound kindness, sometimes on the same day toward different people. A soldier might risk his life to save his wounded comrades, showing courage and loyalty, and then minutes later commit acts of brutality against enemy combatants or civilians, showing the capacity for dehumanization and cruelty. A mother might tenderly care for her own children, showing boundless love and patience, and yet view children from a different ethnic or religious group with suspicion or even hatred, showing how easily our empathy can be constrained by group boundaries. This is the fundamental contradiction of human nature, and it is a contradiction we must learn to live with because neither side of our nature is going away. We cannot evolve out of our capacity for violence, not without also losing some of the traits that make us adaptable and successful. The same testosterone that can fuel aggression also drives ambition and competitiveness. The same tendency to form strong in-group bonds that creates loyalty and cooperation also creates the possibility of viewing outsiders as threats. The same capacity for strategic thinking that allows us to plan and coordinate also allows us to plan and coordinate violence. And so if we cannot change our biology, if we cannot eliminate the potential for violence, what can we do? The answer lies in continuing to develop and strengthen the cultural and social structures that channel our aggressive impulses in less destructive directions, that provide alternatives to violence for resolving conflicts, that expand our circles of empathy and moral consideration. Education plays a crucial role here, teaching children from an early age that violence is not an acceptable solution to problems, that other people, no matter how different they might seem, have hopes and fears and dreams just like we do. Economic opportunity matters too. Poverty and inequality create the conditions where violence becomes more likely, where desperate people turn to crime, or where resentment and anger make populations susceptible to extremist ideologies. Strong institutions matter: rule of law, independent courts, police forces that are accountable to the communities they serve. All of these things help to prevent the descent into the kind of lawlessness where violence becomes the only currency of power. International cooperation matters. When nations work together, when they establish treaties and norms, when they create mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully, the risk of large-scale warfare decreases. And cultural narratives matter: the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we can be. When our movies and television shows and books glorify violence, present it as heroic or exciting, we reinforce the idea that violence is an acceptable and even admirable response to problems. But when our cultural narratives emphasize empathy and understanding, when they show the costs and consequences of violence, when they present cooperation and problem-solving as heroic, we strengthen the social norms that constrain aggression. None of this is to suggest that these solutions are easy, or that they will eliminate violence entirely. Humans have been grappling with the problem of violence for hundreds of thousands of years, and we will likely continue to grapple with it for as long as our species exists. But the historical record gives us reason for hope because it shows that we can change, that we have changed, that the trajectory over the long arc of history has been toward less violence, not more. The challenge we face today is how to continue that progress in an era of rapid technological change, in a world where nuclear weapons and biological weapons and artificial intelligence raise the stakes to existential levels. Can we develop the social and political structures needed to manage these new technologies, to ensure they are used for cooperation rather than destruction? Can we expand our circles of empathy fast enough to keep pace with our expanding technological power? These are the questions that will define the future of our species, and the answers are not predetermined. They will be shaped by the choices we make individually and collectively, by how we choose to organize our societies, by what values we pass on to the next generation we carry within us. The legacy of millions of years of evolution, the capacity for both violence and cooperation, both selfishness and altruism, both hatred and love. Which of these capacities dominates, which becomes the defining characteristic of humanity in the centuries to come, depends on us, on the world we choose to build and the people we choose to be. And so as we look out at the complexity and contradictions of human nature, as we acknowledge both our violent past and our potential for peaceful coexistence, we must ask ourselves, what world do we want to create? What legacy do we want to leave? Because we are not prisoners of our biology. We are not doomed to repeat the cycles of violence that marked our ancestral past. We have proven that we can change, that we can build societies that constrain our worst impulses and elevate our best ones. The question is not whether we are capable of creating a more peaceful world. We have already demonstrated that we are. The question is whether we have the will to continue that work, to build on the progress of previous generations, to pass on to our children a world that is safer, more just, more humane than the one we inherited. And that is a question each of us must answer for ourselves. But to truly understand violence in the modern world, we need to look more closely at the specific factors that contribute to it today, at the psychological, economic, and technological forces that shape when and why violence erupts. One of the most significant factors in modern violence is identity. How we define ourselves and how we define others, and more specifically, how we draw the boundaries between us and them. Throughout human history, group identity has been one of the primary drivers of violence. Tribes fought other tribes, city-states fought other city-states, nations fought other nations, and in every case the conflict was made possible by a psychological process called dehumanization. Dehumanization is what allows us to inflict harm on others without the normal moral constraints that would stop us. It is the mental trick that lets us see certain people not as fully human, not as beings with hopes and fears and families, but as objects or threats or obstacles to be removed. And this process is alarmingly easy to trigger. Experimental research has shown that with relatively simple manipulations, you can get people to view members of an outgroup as less than human. Show them pictures of faces from a different ethnic group while they are viewing disgusting images, and their brains will start to associate that ethnic group with disgust. Tell them stories about that group behaving badly, and they will start to assume all members of that group are bad. Describe that group using animal metaphors, comparing them to vermin or parasites, and people will begin to unconsciously think of them as less than human. And once dehumanization takes hold, violence becomes easier, because harming someone you do not see as fully human does not trigger the same moral revulsion as harming someone you recognize as a person like yourself. We see this pattern in nearly every genocide, every ethnic cleansing, every mass atrocity. Before the killing begins, there is a propaganda campaign designed to dehumanize the target group. In Rwanda, before the genocide against the Tutsi population, the Hutu power radio station repeatedly referred to Tutsis as cockroaches that needed to be exterminated in Nazi Germany. Jews were described as vermin, as a disease infecting the pure German nation in Bosnia. Serb nationalists described Bosnian Muslims as a threat to Serbian survival. And this rhetoric was not just vicious, it was functional. It prepared people psychologically to participate in or at least tolerate mass violence against their neighbours. But dehumanization does not just happen at the level of nations and ethnic groups, it happens in smaller interpersonal contexts as well. Domestic violence often involves a process where the abuser stops seeing their victim as a fully autonomous person with rights and dignity. Gang violence frequently relies on dehumanizing rival gang members, seeing them not as fellow young people struggling with many of the same challenges, but as enemies whose deaths are victories. Even in seemingly mundane contexts like internet comment sections, we can see dehumanization at work. People say things to strangers online that they would never say face to face because the distance and anonymity make it easier to forget that there is a real person on the other end, a person who can be hurt. And this brings us to technology, which has had a profound and complicated impact on modern violence. On one hand, technology has made certain forms of violence easier, more efficient, more devastating. We already discussed how weapons technology has evolved, allowing us to kill from ever greater distances with ever more destructive force. But technology has also changed the social dynamics of violence in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Social media has created new spaces where conflicts can arise and escalate, where people can organise both for peaceful purposes and for violent ones. Extremist groups use social media platforms to recruit, spread propaganda coordinate attacks. The internet allows like-minded individuals who might have been isolated in their local communities to find each other, to reinforce each other's beliefs, to radicalise each other. And the algorithms that govern what content we see on social media often amplify the most extreme and divisive voices, because extreme content generates more engagement, more clicks, more ad revenue. And so the platforms unintentionally create environments where outrage spreads faster than nuance, where anger is rewarded with attention. This has contributed to a rise in what researchers call stochastic terrorism, where inflammatory rhetoric and dehumanizing language spread online eventually inspire individuals to commit acts of violence. We have seen this pattern repeatedly in recent years. Mass shooters who posted manifestos online citing extremist ideologies they encountered on internet forums, individuals who committed acts of violence against religious or ethnic minorities after being radicalized by online propaganda. And the challenge of addressing this form of violence is that it does not fit neatly into our existing frameworks for understanding terrorism or crime. The perpetrators often act alone without direct orders from any organization, making them harder to predict and prevent. But technology is not only a tool for spreading violence, it is also a tool for preventing it. Surveillance cameras and facial recognition technology make it harder for criminals to operate undetected. Forensic science has dramatically improved our ability to solve crimes, deterring would-be offenders and bringing perpetrators to justice. Communication technology allows for faster response times by police and emergency services, potentially saving lives, and big data and artificial intelligence are being used to predict where crimes are likely to occur, allowing for more efficient deployment of resources. And so technology, like so much else in the human story, is a double-edged sword capable of being used for both harm and help. And the question of which way that sword cuts depends on the choices we make about how to develop and deploy these tools. Another crucial factor in modern violence is economics. There is a strong correlation between poverty, inequality, and violent crime when people lack access to legitimate opportunities to support themselves and their families, when they see others living in luxury while they struggle to survive. Resentment builds and violence often follows. This does not mean that poverty automatically causes violence. Plenty of poor communities have low crime rates and plenty of wealthy individuals commit violent acts. But on a population level, the correlation is clear and robust. Neighborhoods with high unemployment, low wages, and few prospects for advancement tend to have higher rates of violent crime. And this makes evolutionary sense. Resources are essential for survival and reproduction, and throughout human history, competition for resources has been a primary driver of violence. When resources are abundant, when everyone has enough, violence becomes less necessary. But when resources are scarce or unequally distributed, the potential for violent conflict increases. Modern drug wars provide a stark example of how economics drives violence in regions where legitimate economic opportunities are scarce, where young men in particular have few paths to status and success. Drug trafficking becomes an attractive option. But the drug trade is inherently violent because it operates outside the law. There is no way to resolve disputes through courts, no police to enforce contracts, and so violence becomes the mechanism for maintaining order within the trade, for punishing those who betray you, for expanding territory and protecting market share. And the consequences are devastating in parts of Mexico and Central America. Drug cartel violence has killed tens of thousands of people. Entire regions have been destabilized, communities torn apart by fear and bloodshed, all driven ultimately by the economics of prohibition. Similar dynamics play out in other contexts. Terrorism often recruits from populations that are economically marginalized. Young men with no jobs, no prospects for the future become susceptible to extremist ideologies that offer them purpose, meaning, a sense of importance. Ethnic conflicts frequently have an economic dimension at their core, people competing for access to land, to water, to resources, to government benefits, and political entrepreneurs exploit these economic grievances, fanning them into ethnic or religious hatred. And so addressing violence requires addressing its economic roots. This does not mean that economic development alone will eliminate violence. Human conflicts have many sources, but it does mean that creating societies where everyone has access to basic opportunities, where hard work can lead to a decent life, where people can support themselves and their families with dignity, this is one of the foundations of peace. Political systems also play a crucial role in either constraining or enabling violent democracies with strong institutions, with free and fair elections, with protections for minority rights, tend to experience less internal violence than authoritarian regimes. This is not because democracies are inherently more moral, but because they provide non-violent mechanisms for resolving conflicts. When people believe they can achieve their goals through voting and advocacy, through peaceful political processes, they are less likely to resort to violence. But when political systems are corrupt or unresponsive, when people feel their voices are not heard, when they believe the system is rigged against them, frustration builds and violence can result. We see this pattern in the way protests sometimes escalate into riots, when protesters feel they are being ignored, when peaceful demonstrations are met with heavy-handed police responses. The situation can quickly spiral out of control. And authoritarian regimes often rely on violence to maintain control without the legitimacy that comes from democratic consent. They must use force to suppress dissent, and this creates a vicious cycle where state violence breeds resistance, which is met with more state violence. But even in democracies, the question of how to manage violence remains complicated. Should the state have a monopoly on legitimate violence? Should police be armed? Should citizens have the right to bear arms for self-defense? These questions are answered differently in different societies, and there is no consensus on the right approach. Some countries have largely disarmed their populations through strict gun control laws, and these countries tend to have lower rates of gun violence, though not necessarily lower rates of violence overall. Other countries maintain armed populations and argue that this protects individual liberty and provides a check against government tyranny. And these debates about the proper role of the state in managing violence reflect deeper philosophical questions about human nature and freedom. If humans are fundamentally dangerous, if we cannot trust ourselves or others to resolve conflicts peacefully, then we need strong state institutions to maintain order. But if humans are fundamentally cooperative, if violence is the exception rather than the rule, then perhaps we should be more worried about state power, about the risk of those institutions being turned toward oppressive ends. There are no easy answers to these questions, and different societies will continue to experiment with different approaches. But what the research suggests is that the most peaceful societies are not necessarily those with the most restrictions or the most freedom, but those that have found a balance that maintains social cohesion while respecting individual rights. Youth violence deserves special attention because it represents both a significant portion of violent crime and an opportunity for intervention. Young people, particularly young men, are disproportionately likely to engage in violence. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Young males in many primate species are the most aggressive because they are in the peak competition phase of their lives, competing for status, for mates, for resources. Testosterone levels are high. Risk-taking behavior is common, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. And so young men are in some ways primed for violence, but they are also highly responsive to their environment, to the messages they receive about what is acceptable, to the opportunities available to them, to the presence or absence of positive role models. Programs that intervene with at-risk youth, that provide mentorship, job training, education, conflict resolution skills, have shown real success in reducing violence. When young people have a path forward, have something to lose, they are less likely to make choices that lead to violence. But these programs require investment and commitment, and in many places, especially poor communities, they are chronically underfunded. And so young people who might have turned away from violence with the right support instead get drawn deeper into it. And once someone has engaged in serious violence, once they have committed a violent crime and been incarcerated, the challenge of rehabilitation becomes even more difficult. Prisons in many countries do not rehabilitate. They often make the problem worse by exposing inmates to more violence, by cutting them off from positive social connections, by making it harder to find legitimate work after release. And so we see high rates of recidivism, people cycling in and out of prison, unable to break free from the cycle of violence, alternatives to incarceration programs that focus on restorative justice, that bring perpetrators face to face with their victims, that require them to make amends, have shown promise in reducing recidivism, but they remain controversial and relatively rare. Addressing youth violence then requires a comprehensive approach, one that intervenes early before young people become entrenched in violent patterns, that provides alternatives and opportunities, that treats violence as a public health issue, as something that can be prevented rather than just punished after the fact. And it requires recognizing that while humans have the capacity for violence, we also have the capacity for change, that people are not defined by their worst moments, that with the right support and circumstances, individuals who have committed violence can turn their lives around, can become productive members of society. This is not naive idealism, it is pragmatism, because the alternative perpetuating cycles of violence passing trauma and aggression from one generation to the next is a recipe for ongoing suffering. And so as we think about violence in the modern world, we must grapple with all these factors: identity and dehumanization, technology and its double-edged impacts, economics and opportunity, political systems and how they channel or constrain conflict, the special challenges of youth violence. None of these factors operates in isolation. They interact in complex ways, creating the specific patterns of violence we see in different societies at different times. But understanding these factors gives us tools for intervention levers we can pull to reduce violence, not eliminate it, but reduce it to make our societies safer, more humane. And that work of building a less violent world is not something that can be left to governments or institutions alone. It requires all of us examining our own biases, challenging dehumanizing rhetoric when we encounter it, supporting policies and programs that address the root causes of violence, raising children who understand that violence is not an acceptable solution to problems. There is a moment that occurs sometimes in the aftermath of violence, a moment of clarity where the fog of rage and fear lifts and people look at what they have done and ask themselves, how did we get here? This happened in Rwanda. After the genocide ended, neighbours who had killed neighbours' former friends who had participated in massacres sat in community courts called Gakaka, trying to understand what had possessed them, trying to find a path toward reconciliation. It happened in South Africa after apartheid ended with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where perpetrators and victims came together to tell their stories, to try to heal the wounds that decades of violence had created. It happens on a smaller scale too, when someone who committed a violent crime years ago works up the courage to reach out to their victim, to apologize, to try to make amends in whatever way possible. These moments of reconciliation, of recognizing the humanity in those we have harmed, do not erase the violence, do not undo the damage, but they represent something profound. They represent the other side of human nature, the capacity for growth, for change, for choosing a different path forward. And if we are going to build a less violent future, we need to understand and cultivate this capacity just as much as we need to understand the roots of violence itself. One of the most important insights from psychology research over the past few decades is the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and rewire itself throughout life. We are not locked into patterns established in childhood or by our genes. We can develop new ways of thinking, new ways of responding to conflict, new habits of mind. Meditation and mindfulness practices have been shown to reduce reactivity, to help people pause before responding with anger. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help people recognize and change thought patterns that lead to violence programs. Teaching empathy and perspective taking can increase pro-social behavior. In other words, we can train ourselves to be less violent, to be more cooperative, to respond to frustration and threat with something other than aggression. And this is true not just at the individual level, but at the societal level as well. Cultural norms can shift sometimes quite rapidly. Things that were once widely accepted, slavery, corporal punishment of children, dueling to settle disputes, have become unacceptable in most societies. The question for us now is, what norms will we establish for the future as we develop ever more powerful technologies, as we face global challenges that require unprecedented levels of cooperation? Will we find ways to constrain violence even further, or will we slide backward into tribal conflicts amplified by modern weapons? The stakes have never been higher because the technologies we now possess, nuclear weapons, engineered pathogens, artificial intelligence systems that could be weaponized, have the potential to cause harm on a scale that was unimaginable to our ancestors. A single nuclear exchange between major powers could kill hundreds of millions directly and potentially billions more through nuclear winter and its impact on agriculture. A deliberately released pandemic could spread across the globe in weeks, killing indiscriminately. Artificial intelligence, if developed without proper safeguards, could pose existential risks we are only beginning to understand. And so the question of human violence is no longer just about individual safety or even national security. It has become a question of species survival. Can we as a species develop the wisdom and the institutions necessary to manage these technologies responsibly? Can we expand our circles of empathy fast enough to recognize that we are all in this together, that national and ethnic and religious divisions are luxuries we can no longer afford? There are reasons for pessimism, the same tribalistic instincts that served our ancestors well. The tendency to trust our own group and view outsiders with suspicion persist despite our intellectual understanding that we are all one species. These instincts are difficult to overcome. Political leaders continue to exploit divisions for their own gain because fear and hatred are powerful motivators that can be used to consolidate power. Economic systems continue to generate massive inequality, creating the conditions where resentment festers and violence erupts. And the pace of technological change may be outstripping our ability to adapt socially. We are trying to manage 21st century problems with brains and social structures that evolved for a very different world. But there are also reasons for hope. We have demonstrated repeatedly that we can overcome our worst instincts, that we can build institutions and norms that constrain violence, that we can learn and grow and change. The long arc of history bends toward greater cooperation, not less toward expanding circles of moral consideration, not shrinking ones toward more peace, not more violence. And this is not inevitable, not predetermined, but it is possible. It is within our reach if we choose it. The field of peace studies, which emerged after World War II, has identified several key factors that correlate with peaceful societies, and while no single factor guarantees peace, the combination of these elements creates environments where violence is less likely. Strong democratic institutions with checks on power, where leaders are accountable to citizens, economic opportunity, where everyone has access to at least basic necessities, education that teaches critical thinking and empathy, social safety nets that prevent people from falling into desperate circumstances, international cooperation and strong norms against the use of force. And we can see these factors at work in the most peaceful regions of the world today. Northern Europe, for instance, has some of the lowest rates of violence globally, not because Europeans are genetically different, but because they have built societies that embody many of these principles. This does not mean these societies are perfect. They face their own challenges: racism, inequality, rising nationalism. But the framework they have created provides a foundation for peace. And that framework can be replicated, it can be adapted to different cultural contexts, it can be built upon and improved, but doing so requires resources and political will. It requires investment in education and social programs. It requires reforming criminal justice systems to focus on rehabilitation rather than just punishment. It requires international cooperation and a commitment to multilateral institutions. And perhaps most importantly, it requires a shift in how we think about security. For most of human history, security has been understood primarily in military terms: having a strong army, fortifications, the ability to defeat your enemies by force, but in an interconnected world where threats do not respect borders, where economic instability in one region can ripple across the globe, where climate change and pandemics affect everyone. Security has to be understood more broadly. True security requires addressing the root causes of violence, poverty, inequality, injustice. It requires building resilient communities where people have a stake in the system, where they see a path forward for themselves and their children. It requires finding ways to disagree, without demonizing, to compete without destroying, to maintain our distinct identities and cultures while recognizing our common humanity. This is enormously difficult work. There are no easy answers, no simple solutions. Conflicts that have simmered for generations cannot be resolved overnight. Trauma that has been passed down through families and communities takes time to heal, but the alternative, accepting violence as inevitable, allowing the cycles to continue, is unacceptable, not only on moral grounds but on practical ones, because the costs of violence are too high and the risks too great. Every life lost to violence is a tragedy, not just for the victim and their loved ones, but for all of us, because we have lost whatever contribution that person might have made, whatever joy and creativity and love they might have brought into the world, and beyond the immediate human cost. Violence diverts resources that could be used for education, healthcare, infrastructure. Instead of building, we are destroying. Instead of creating, we are taking apart. The global cost of violence has been estimated at trillions of dollars annually, money that could have been used to lift people out of poverty, to advance science and medicine, to address climate change. And so reducing violence is not just a moral imperative, it is an economic and practical one as well. It is in everyone's self-interest to build more peaceful societies. But self-interest alone will not get us there. We also need moral leadership, people who are willing to stand up and say that violence is wrong, even when it is expedient, even when it is popular, even when it is directed at people we do not like. We need people who will refuse to participate in dehumanization, who will insist on seeing the humanity in everyone, including those we disagree with, including those who have harmed us. This is perhaps the hardest thing we can ask of people, to extend empathy to those who do not deserve it, to break cycles of revenge and retaliation, to choose forgiveness, not because the offence was not serious, but because revenge only perpetuates the violence. And yet throughout history there have been individuals and communities who have made that choice, who have found the strength to respond to violence with something other than more violence. Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison, could have emerged filled with rage and bitterness. Instead, he led South Africa toward reconciliation. Martin Luther King Jr. faced violence and hatred and responded with a philosophy of non-violent resistance that ultimately changed a nation. There are countless less famous examples as well. Former gang members who now work to steer young people away from violent survivors of genocide, who have dedicated their lives to preventing future atrocities. Parents who have lost children to violence and, instead of seeking revenge, have campaigned for peace. These individuals remind us that we are not prisoners of our worst instincts, that we have the capacity to choose a different path. And that capacity for choice is what ultimately defines us as humans. We are not driven purely by instinct like other animals. We can reflect on our impulses. We can consider the consequences of our actions. We can decide who we want to be. The violence in our past does not determine our future. The aggressive tendencies we inherited from our evolutionary ancestors do not have to control us. We are complicated, messy, contradictory beings capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary kindness. We are vengeful and we are forgiving. We are selfish and we are altruistic. We are destructive and we are creative. And which of these tendencies dominates, which becomes the defining characteristic of our species, depends on the choices we make every day, in how we treat each other, in how we raise our children, in how we structure our societies, in what values we choose to prioritize. The archaeological record tells us that violence has been part of the human story from the very beginning. The bones scattered across the world bearing the marks of ancient conflicts make that clear. But that same archaeological record also shows evidence of care of people who were injured and disabled being supported by their communities for years of elaborate burials, suggesting belief systems that valued life and mourned death of art and music and ritual that speak to our capacity for beauty and meaning. And so the story of humanity is not simply a story of violence. It is a story of violence and compassion, of competition and cooperation, of taking life and cherishing it. As we stand here today, at this particular moment in human history, we carry all of that history with us, the accumulated wisdom and folly of hundreds of thousands of years. We know what leads to violence, and we know what leads to peace. We understand the factors that make conflict more likely, and the conditions that make cooperation possible. The question is whether we will use that knowledge, whether we will make the investments and the sacrifices necessary to build a less violent world. This is not about achieving some utopian vision where conflict disappears entirely. Humans will always have disagreements, will always compete for resources and status, will always experience anger and frustration, but we can change how we respond to those feelings. We can choose not to let them escalate into violence. We can build systems and norms that provide alternatives to using force. And we must do this not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us, because the world we create, the choices we make, will shape their reality, will determine whether they inherit a world moving toward greater peace or sliding toward catastrophe. The capacity for violence will always be part of human nature, but so is the capacity for change, and in the end, that may be the most important thing to understand about who we are. We are not fixed, we are not determined, we are works in progress individually and collectively capable of becoming better than we have been, and that possibility, that potential for growth and transformation is what gives us hope in the face of all the violence and suffering in the world. Because if we can understand where violence comes from, if we can recognize it in ourselves, if we can see the systems and circumstances that make it more likely, then we can intervene. We can make different choices. We can build different systems. We are not passive observers of history. We are participants, and the future is not written. It will be shaped by what we do, by the values we uphold, by the world we choose to create. And so, as we look back at the long, bloody history of human violence, as we acknowledge the darkness that is part of our nature, we can also look forward with determination to do better, to be better, because we have proven that we can change, that progress is possible, that the arc of history bends toward justice and peace when people push it in that direction. The work of building a less violent world is never finished. It is something each generation must take up anew, but it is work worth doing because every life saved, every conflict resolved peacefully, every cycle of revenge broken is a victory for the better angels of our nature. And in the end, that is what this investigation into human violence has revealed, not just that we are capable of terrible things, but that we are also capable of overcoming those tendencies, of choosing a different path, of building something better. The choice is ours, and it always has been.